What if the deadliest weapon ever conceived wasn't a bomb, but an army of 1,000,000 winged creatures? In January of 1942, a truly bizarre proposal landed on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's desk. While America was focused on building bigger tanks, faster planes, and more powerful battleships, this idea came from a completely different realm. It wasn't about steel or conventional explosives. It was about weaponizing the night, turning a living, breathing creature into an army of millions of tiny, unstoppable incendiary bombers. The weapon was a bat. The target was the entire nation of Japan. The audacious idea belonged to Little S. Adams, a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania with a restless, inventive mind. The concept struck him not in a war room, but during a vacation to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. There, he witnessed the breathtaking spectacle of millions of bats spiraling out of the cave at dusk, a living, chittering tornado darkening the sky. Weeks later, the attack on Pearl Harbor plunged America into war, desperate for a way to strike back at an enemy thousands of miles across the Pacific. Adams, with a flash of bizarre genius, connected the two events. He knew that Japanese cities, unlike American or European ones, were built largely of wood, bamboo, and paper. They were, in his own words, the greatest fire hazard the world has ever known. What if, he wondered, he could attach a tiny incendiary bomb to each of those millions of bats? What if he could drop them from a high-altitude bomber over Japan? The bats would disperse, seeking shelter in the dark eaves and attics of the very wooden buildings he wanted to burn. After a set time, their tiny bombs would ignite. It wouldn't be one fire or 100. It would be 1,000,000 points of fire starting simultaneously from the inside out in thousands of locations at once. It would be an unstoppable biological firestorm. The plan was by any rational measure completely insane. But in the desperate winter of 1942, insanity looked a lot like innovation. Little Adams wrote a detailed proposal and sent it directly to the White House. In normal times, such a letter would have been discarded as the ravings of a madman. But these were not normal times. The letter passed through several channels, eventually reaching President Roosevelt himself. FDR, a man known for his willingness to entertain unconventional ideas, saw the strange logic in the madness. He passed the proposal to the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, OSS, with a simple appended note. "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." With that single sentence, one of the strangest projects of World War II was given the green light. The project was handed over to a team of America's top scientists under the oversight of the U.S. Army Air Force. The lead chemist on the project was none other than Louis Fieser, the very same man who had just invented napalm. The scientific challenges were immense, a cascade of seemingly impossible problems. First, the bat. They needed a species that was abundant, strong enough to carry a small payload, hibernated for long periods, and could be easily gathered in massive numbers. After studying numerous species, they settled on the Mexican free-tailed bat. There were millions of them in caves across the American Southwest. They were robust, and they flew at high altitudes. They were the perfect biological chassis for the weapon. Next, the bomb. It had to be incredibly small and lightweight, yet powerful enough to start a raging fire. Louis Fieser and his team developed a miniature incendiary device. It was a tiny cellulose capsule, just a few inches long, filled with a secret thickened kerosene, a precursor to napalm. It weighed only 17.5 grams, about the weight of 3/4 of an ounce. The ignition system was a masterpiece of miniature engineering, a tiny spring-loaded striker held back by a thin steel wire. This wire would be corroded by a copper chloride solution, the timing of which could be precisely controlled. The mathematics were terrifying. A single B-24 bomber could carry over 100 canisters. Each canister could hold over 1,000 bats. That meant a single plane could unleash more than 100,000 tiny living firebombs on a city. An entire squadron could deploy millions. With the components designed, the project entered its industrial phase. This was where American ingenuity met American scale. First, they had to acquire the bats. The government hired a team of bat wranglers, a motley crew of naturalists and adventurers, to venture into the vast cave systems of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Their job was to capture millions of bats alive. The scenes were surreal. Men in protective gear would enter enormous caverns, the air thick with the smell of guano and the sound of a million chittering voices. They would use giant nets and chilled trucks to capture and transport the hibernating creatures to secret military airfields. It was a logistical nightmare. The bats were delicate, prone to injury, and would often wake up and escape. But the project demanded numbers, and the wranglers delivered. Simultaneously, factories were being tooled up to mass-produce the tiny incendiary devices. Each bomb was a marvel of chemical and mechanical precision. The 17.5-gram incendiary was attached to the bat's chest using a simple surgical clip and a piece of string. After the bat was released and found to roost, it would chew through the string, freeing itself from the device, which would then fall into the highly flammable nesting material of a Japanese attic. The timer, a copper chloride solution eating through a steel wire, was the project's ticking heart. The scientists could calibrate the corrosion time from 30 minutes to several hours, allowing the bombers to be long gone before the city below erupted in flames. The deployment system was just as ingenious. The bats would be placed into a state of hibernation by cooling them down to just 4 degrees C. They would then be stacked carefully, 1,040 bats at a time, into a special self-deploying canister that looked like a conventional bomb. This canister would be dropped from 10,000 feet. As it fell, a parachute would deploy, and the canister's sides would fall away, releasing the dormant bats into the cold air. The shock of the cold air would awaken them from their hibernation, and they would do what bats always do: fly to the nearest dark, sheltered place to roost. In this case, the eaves, attics, and rafters of every wooden building in a 20-mile radius. It was a biological, self-guiding smart bomb, invented 50 years ahead of its time. The Japanese air defenses designed to shoot down planes would be powerless against a million tiny flapping targets. In May of 1943, at a remote auxiliary airbase near Carlsbad, New Mexico, the project faced its first major field test. And it was here that the scientists received their first terrifying glimpse of just how well their creation worked. A problem had arisen. Some of the bats were not staying in hibernation during transport. During one test, a canister of armed bats was being loaded onto a bomber. Several of the bats, having woken up prematurely, managed to escape the canister and fly away. They immediately did what they were programmed to do. They sought shelter in the nearest dark structures, in this case, the wooden hangars and buildings of the Carlsbad Army Airfield itself. The project staff watched in horror, powerless to stop what they had set in motion. The timers on the tiny incendiary devices were ticking. A short while later, the first wisps of smoke appeared. Then a flicker of flame. Within minutes, the base was on fire. The administration building, the control tower, several hangars, and a general's personal car were all engulfed in a raging inferno. The base fire department was overwhelmed. The base commander, watching his command post burn to the ground, could only stare in disbelief. His base had been destroyed not by an enemy attack, but by his own top-secret weapon. The incident was a disaster, a colossal embarrassment that was quickly covered up. But for the scientists of Project Bat, it was something else entirely. It was the ultimate, horrifying proof of concept. The plan worked. It worked too well. Their biological weapon, designed to be unstoppable, had proven to be just that. They couldn't even control it on their own home turf. One of the lead scientists in a classified report wrote a sobering conclusion. The weapon, he stated, is an uncontrollable destroyer. The accidental destruction of the Carlsbad base was a more convincing demonstration than any planned test could have been. It was the moment the absurd idea became a terrifying reality. They had successfully created a monster. Now they had to figure out how to harness it. The Carlsbad incident, despite the destruction, convinced the military that the project had immense potential. It was too valuable to abandon. The program was taken from the Army and given to the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, who gave it a new, more serious code name, Project X-Ray. The new team, led by Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel H.L. Stun Stillwell, refined every aspect of the weapon with ruthless efficiency. They perfected the hibernation and transport process. They redesigned the deployment canister, creating a system of stacked trays that would separate in midair, ensuring a wider and more even distribution of the bats. The weapon was becoming more reliable, more predictable, and infinitely more deadly. The culmination of Project X-ray came in the summer of 1944 at a secret test site in the Utah desert. The Army had built a full-scale replica of a Japanese industrial town, complete with authentic wooden houses and factories, meticulously constructed to match the building materials and styles of urban Japan. They called it simply Japanese Village. This would be the final test. A bomber flew over the mock city and released a single canister of bats, each carrying a live 17.5-gram incendiary. The results were recorded by observers in high-speed cameras, and the numbers they recorded were staggering. The official report, declassified decades later, reads like a document from a science fiction nightmare. The test was declared an overwhelming success. The bat bombs were calculated to be 30 times more effective at starting fires than conventional incendiary bombs of the same weight. While standard bombs might start a dozen fires, the bats from that single canister started fires in virtually every single structure in the test village. Analysis concluded that a full-scale raid using bat bombs would create a firestorm so vast and widespread that it would be completely unstoppable. General Stilwell, who had initially been skeptical, wrote in his diary, "It can be concluded that X-ray is an effective weapon." It was the military's understated way of saying they had created hell on earth and given it wings. The weapon was ready. Production was scaled up. 1 million bats were being prepared. 1 million bombs were being manufactured. The invasion of Japan was scheduled for the spring of 1945, and Project X-ray was slated to be its terrifying opening act. The weapon was perfected. The logistics were in place. The target was waiting. And then, in the winter of 1944, just as Project X-ray was about to go into full production for deployment, the order came down from the highest levels of military command. The project was canceled. After 2 years of work, $2 million in funding, a colossal sum at the time, and the efforts of some of America's best scientific minds, the bat bomb was being shelved. Why? Why would the military abandon a weapon that had just been proven to be overwhelmingly effective? A weapon that promised to shorten the war and save American lives? The answer lies not in failure, but in the shadow of an even bigger, more terrible secret. While the scientists of Project X-ray were trying to strap tiny bombs to living creatures, another group of scientists in another secret location were trying to split the atom. While Project X-ray was a race to create a weapon of mass fire, the Manhattan Project was a race to create a weapon of mass annihilation. And the Manhattan Project was winning. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, after reviewing the status of both projects, made the final decision. The bat bomb, he concluded, would not be ready for combat until mid-1945. The atomic bomb they believed could be ready by the summer of that same year. The American war machine, for all its infinite capacity, had to choose. It was a race between two unprecedented superweapons. One was a biological storm of fire, 1 million tiny points of light designed to burn a nation from the inside out. The other was the power of a star, unleashed in a single blinding flash. The bat bomb was a weapon of mass disruption. The atomic bomb was a weapon of mass finality. In the cold, hard calculus of total war, finality won. The bat bomb was deemed too slow, too unpredictable, and ultimately not decisive enough compared to the absolute power being unlocked in the deserts of Los Alamos. Project X-ray was canceled, its secrets buried, its army of 1 million bat soldiers disbanded before they ever saw combat. Project X-ray was shelved, becoming a bizarre footnote in the long history of secret weapons, but its legacy lingered. The tiny incendiary developed by Louis Fieser for the bats was a direct ancestor of the napalm that would be used to devastating effect in the firebombing of Tokyo and later in Korea and Vietnam. The project itself stands as a chilling monument to the sheer terrifying creativity of wartime ingenuity. It represents a moment in history when, in the desperate pursuit of victory, a nation was willing to blur the line between the natural and the artificial, to turn a living creature into a component in a weapon system, and to build an army out of a force of nature. The official records are clear. The tests were successful. The weapon worked. And this forces us to ask a haunting question. What if? What if the atomic bomb had been delayed? What if Project X-ray had been deployed? What would the skies over Tokyo have looked like on that spring morning in 1945, filled not with B-29 seconds, but with 1 million tiny flapping soldiers, each carrying a spark of napalm. What would it have been like on the ground as a million fires ignited simultaneously in a million different places? A plague of incandescent fury unleashed from the heavens. We will never know. The story of the bat bomb is the ultimate example of America's wartime philosophy. Try everything. No idea was too wild, no concept too absurd if it promised a path to victory. While the Germans were trying to perfect the V-2 rocket, a marvel of engineering, the Americans were trying to strap bombs to bats. It was a clash of philosophies, rigid scientific perfection versus chaotic, pragmatic innovation. And in this strange, secret war of ideas, the plan to burn down Japan using an army of bats came terrifyingly close to becoming a reality. It remains a testament to a time when the line between genius and madness was not just blurred, but completely erased in the desperate, all-consuming furnace of total war.